All right. I'm Walter Schlecht. I am the Germanic Languages and Literatures and Comparative Literature Subject Librarian here at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm thrilled that all of you have joined us for our final International Writers Series event of the semester. And I just am going over some technical things before handing it off to the incomparable Matthias Goeritz. This is a Zoom webinar, so your cameras and mics are disabled. There will be a Zoom reception after this, where if you have questions for the panelists, you can make them there. And during the webinar will last 1 hour. The reception will be at 8:30. If you're interested in that, I'll post the Zoom link in a minute. But I believe that's all the announcements I have for now. And we can move on to Matthias.
Thank you, Walter. Welcome and welcome back for this last event of the third season of the International Writers Series, a collaboration between the International Writers track of the program in Comparative Literature and the university libraries to celebrate new publications of creative works by writers and translators in our community at Washington University in St. Louis. In this virtual reading and discussion, distinguished guest, poet, translator, and editor Matvei Yankelevich will discuss his new chapbook From a Winter Notebook and his recent translations of the poetry of Osip Mandelstam. Yankelevich will be joined in discussion by Anca Roncea, a poet, translator, and PhD student in comparative literature in the track for international writers. But let me begin with one of Matvei's poem. A poem from a Winter Notebook, which just came out recently as a gorgeous chapbook with order and Francia. In fact, I think I should call it more of a book object, a work of art, thoughtfully made and quite a delight to hold in one's hands. This poem from a Winter Notebook is very dear to me because of the hypnotic state of meditation it includes. As winter went on, every morning's spoon of buckwheat honey resembled more the taste of that isosceles at midpoint of your weight. Its smell brought sweetly back the pendulum-like pace, moving us from windowsill to floor, from floor to bed and back to floor, mapping haste's measure of the room, our smell, but also meuble, book dust, hanging smoke, an open bottle, everything connecting now for me, as smells will do, things that don't connect, may not be mine in memory, like childhood's corridors, cats, others' bodies, and maybe other minds. All this from the spoon, sweet, grassy in my nose, cloying almost, bitter on the tongue, yet as clear as memory of pace, of smell, of movement made, strange. Where's the sound of us as we moved with one another? Not only are we lingering over events from the past, from a personal story elegantly gestured to a love story, the impossible desire to retrieve lost love, but also furnished with the residue of everyday life, old family stories perhaps, and even some reminiscences of vanished childhood. A poem which reminds us in its tenderness, its insistence on the impossible task of bringing things back, its Orphic heroism and lyrical precision of Proust and his connecting in remembrance of time past of taste and memory. Here, not a Madeleine, but a spoon of buckwheat honey. Yet Matvei Yankelevich, the poet who is our guest tonight, also meditates on the very nature of poetic language. Smells, dust, an almost bitter taste on the tongue, the secrecy of things, even things pointed out and to in foreign tongues. The French word meuble for furniture, as an example, opens childhood's corridors of memories, asks if these are real or instead made from other minds, from other bodies. In fact, all living things include newly imagined memories emerge in the hypnotic slow pace of this poem as words and movements, like buckwheat honey dripping from a spoon. The preposition from a Winter's Notebook is a deceptively simple word, positioning and mixing questions of origin and cause and effect, all observed, absorbed, or created in the process of writing. In a 4 minutes interview for Poetry Now, Matvei remarked on his recently renewed interest in the personal, the intimate, and even the sentimental, while adapting a more florid, decorative writing style. He describes his love of old-fashioned word order, lyrical introspection, and classic meter restrictions as motivating, a form of resistance against the modernist credo of make it new and the overload of politics in poetry. Matvei Yankelevich's books include the long poem Some Worlds for Dr. Vogt, the poetry collection Alpha Donut, and the novella in fragments Boris by the Sea. He is the translator of Today I Wrote Nothing, the selected writings of Daniel Harms, and co-translator with Eugene Ostashevsky of the National Translation Award-winning An Invitation for Me to Think by Alexander Веденский. He has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York Foundation for the Arts, and the National Endowment for Humanities. In the 1990s, he co-founded Ugly Duckling Press, where he edited, designed, and produced a variety of books, chapbooks, periodicals, and broadsides, co-edited small magazines, and curated the Eastern European Poets series. He teaches translation and book arts at Columbia University's School of the Arts. Matvei is also a member of the writing faculty at the Milton Avery Graduate School of the Arts at Bard College, a liberal art college up the Hudson River, which is also very dear to our second guest tonight. Matvei will be joined in discussion by poet and translator Anca Roncea, who grew up in Romanian, speaks modern Greek and French, and writes and publishes in English. She's currently a PhD student in the International Writers Track in Comparative Literature at Washington University in St. Louis. Her work can be found in the Berkeley Poetry Review, Beaches Magazine, Omniverse, and Asymptote, the Bear Life Review, and Lana Turner. Her translation of Tribar, poems by Romanian poet Andra Rotaru, won the Melinda A. Markham Memorial Prize in Translation and will soon appear with Saturnalia Books. I would like to thank Washington University's library for making these events possible, as well as the Committee on Contemporary Comparative Literature and simply all other departments of arts and sciences and numerous individuals who are involved. I want furthermore to take a moment to express my special thanks and deepest gratitude to our incomparable subject librarian Walter Slecht, who is my partner in crime in setting up the International Writers Series. He is, as you have seen, currently overseeing all the technical stuff of our webinar. Let us now delve deeply into Matvei's beautiful poems and his Mandelstam translations. Please join me in welcoming Matvei Yankelevich and Anca Roncea with a big round of virtual applause. Enjoy the conversation and the readings during the next 60 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthias. That was such an eloquent and insightful intro, and your analysis of that poem. I could not hope for more, really. That was incredible, and left me a little speechless. Anca, thank you for agreeing to be my interlocutor for this event, and thanks, Walter, for setting things up. Anca, do you think, so I should start with some readings, or do you want to, okay. So I'm going to read from, I like to say this, I'm going to read from a winter notebook, which Matthias correctly pointed out is a kind of, I like the way that from kind of reminds you of this weird word. And of course, the poems are not exactly just from a winter notebook. They are excerpts, and they are reimaginings of things in notebooks. I should say it's a project that I've been working on for about 6, 7 years, maybe more, that is very long. And this chapbook, which I will show you in a second, is very short. It's just a few of the earlier poems in this series. And there are some constraints, and one of them is very obvious, and you'll hear it in every poem. I'll also read a few newer poems, that some of which will be coming out in another chapbook, but all from the same series, from a winter notebook. Editors at magazines get really upset with me because I'm always insisting that that when they publish an excerpt or a poem from this series, they have to write from. And so, okay. I'm going to just show you, if I can share my screen. Just a second. Show you what this chapbook looks like. I don't mean to advertise it, but this is the easiest way for me to show you what's going on here in terms of the visual work done by Emily Larned, designer and printer in Connecticut, who runs the press Alder and Francia. These are some shots of the assembly process of the book. I think that's the corner rounder, yes. So it has round corners. But you'll see that she employed a lot of various kinds of notebook styles and papers that could ostensibly be in a notebook. So I'll read a few from here. And hopefully some that have to do with issues of translation and foreignness and other things, some things that that Matthias brought up. It is winter, a way to begin, formless, not in a narrow notebook, narrow in light. A fat brown bug greets me at the door, who knows how long it's been half dead or full dead, for that matter. Now from dustpan to flushing gutter, same as unplanned cant. Mine this slant speech, saber of our commerce and its sword, to ensure profit. I prefer it to pretending nature. Let it ring the more so as dom, dom, dom is home, doomed bell, calling us back from battle to same office of winter poems. In winter, I begin again to be pretentiosen, and coming home to a record of my successful arrival in the world, I celebrate myself with as mediocre a wine as I can afford to be cut off from chatter. A pressure builds behind the eyes, the kettle whines, the record skips. I need not publish this, just throw it, for I've been good and slept alone and not been touched by anything, not even birdsong, nor friends, nor first snow on ancient wharves. Only the cold cement through thin soles in the warehouse, where half the lights work. I bring them with me to where I forget to follow through, where it's enough to say these few things. It is winter, a gray slate to chance, to desire, to be less. The anniversary is coming. Whose ghost will look over my shoulder now as I'm shaving? Roy was right on. Love is evil. 50 years on, who needs it? Freedom, poetry, though at one time it seemed necessary. Bills and books muck out a desk. Watch me run magic fingers above my chalk cahiers. This one's for me. It's too short. It's winter and someone is writing the same poem as I am, with better penmanship, in pencil. Our animate conversation underground because we know one of us will soon be getting off. Guy I met says his pages are all white because this publishing scene's all about community. Bona fide. We're American and there's our own language to worry about. Paint watercolors with wine. Invite me to the opening. It is winter and no mastery is trending. What's this being loved for who you are instead of loved despite it? Thereof I scratch my back as winter fills with lack of what's for dinner. I truck on into inheritance of burnt bridges, but won't kitch about all the dynamite connections I forced upon myself. Yet, months later, it's your knees I conjure in the shower when lather hardens that bit of flesh, you know, which centers desire. Sink into another, what comes of it? I care little long as I'm rid of my handwriting. Platitudes, lifestyles, snow, shovels, turn them this way and turn them that. Winter, no thing new under the sun. What comes up again was that which was under snow. Clod-like clouds overhead, pebble underfoot. I ran for the train. Why? I got there early. Color of Retsina. I wanted to drink, to make time, to drill holes out and build. I said, find another, yet the ghost of it is in me. In my room, new shelves already full of nothing, dead jerks. Come, let's burn down this waning winter's wax museum so that no more can children queue noisily to see originality and muses pose with genius and historic action heroes. It's in there too, the nation, pallbearer to identity. Long years past, spring and all y'all, this democratization of poetry isn't for everyone, but not for me. As John Donne says, have a good time. Was it Paul Simon? Don't get shit on your hands. It is winter, a grammar with no relation to me, diagrammed, disconnected. I can't call these sentences my own, not that I'm that important. It's tough to be a sentence in winter, a gray angle, a tall circle. Laughter buckles under its own light, a piece of air behind the ear, a trick sniffed out by underdogs, a to-do list that includes itself. Tomorrow, brother, I'll get to it. Winter comes calling while I'm on vacation. Autoresponder, etc. The book's not done. Mail piled like snow. Of a sudden, life looks brief. Just this mangled foam, this form for which you've spared no part. There might not be a chance to change or quit changing. My blue notebook's sad and modern. So if I write, the self is wispy, sure, but strike that line. They say you can't edit poetry, but I say, fuck it. It's winter because it's winter, because it's snow, because the snow smells of gasoline, because of exhaust and exhaustion, because I want to paint and be free, because I've made it this far, because I'm ready for it. It's winter. It is winter because it took all year to edit this sentence. Because it's winter, and because I'm slipping, it's winter, so it's winter. And because by the time I take off my coat, whip off my winding scarf, remember of my vest, zip out, find a seat for a hat, untie and unlace and pull off the boots, grope the light, bear down on the notebook, note the warmth, grapple a pen to uncap it, the poem part of the poem is gone. So I think I read for about 10 minutes. Maybe I'll read one or two, couple new ones. Is that good? So a couple of these are coming out in a new chapbook following from a winter notebook, but it is called, it's going to be called Dead Winter. And that's actually from this next poem, that little phrase, but it's also really from a translation of Ovid, whose Black Sea letters are a kind of source for some of these poems. His exile and that will become clear anyway. How begin after the screen pushed back, as if there's a world to go back to later? No omens left. Invent them, throwing forms at glass, whatever sticks. I can work this stylus in my sleep, but learn a parole to map the cracks. Oh, wow. Okay, sorry. That there was some glitch in my screen, okay, which is appropriate. To map the cracks of my phone for a way to you. My Ovid wants to go home, translated even if only as a body for burial. How far that wan world and to which end? So sad to be sand, sad sack, so dod. Pity the chair's hard times under my weight, as the desk must evocation make. A young runner runs by into green identity, whereas I, barely a graying stone in the cold's gray manor where I work on what is my life. It's as if. Of course, one can look out a window, one can float by, remark how one's floating, dead winter running into winter. Here's another one with that theme, or with some similar reminiscences. Now that it's winter, might pray to green trees to see the star bring in a season in which I sit metastasizing in my briefs by the breeze of a blue fan with some same complaints, so that if you came upon me there now, you would not recognize me, but it's me. The curve of my back, same emails, same friend requests ignored. Should I give up for Martians don't speak through me? I'm observing this lack of purpose proliferate in my cell walls. My whole awareness is of distraction. Doubt my erotic verse will come to light, bright residency, or exile on the Black Sea, where I'd stare at brutal resorts built over the beach. Can't say I'm fond of this coercion, but every night I try to do something with meaning to break what keeps coming back. So I tie up a sack and anchor a word to the bottom of water. It's a syntax, but it's not a life. So how do you feel? Should we go on to the next sentence or one more?
I think it's a syntax, but it's not a life. It's such a wonderful line. All over us
Okay,
now.
we'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Matvei, for this reading.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely beautiful. And speaking of Ovid, I remember that he was actually quite in pain during the winter on the Black Sea because it was much colder than he was used to in the Roman Empire, which it still is, which quite just as cold despite global warming. Thank you. There's so many beautiful, compelling, and so many moments that I think speak to so much of thinking through poetry in the now. I'm stuck on this line, the poem, part of a poem is gone, and the image of trying to write it and trying to get to it. And I'm really interested in how many of these of the poems in this beautiful book are think so much in the now and try to situate themselves in the time. It is winter. It actually, as you were reading, it made me think of the, I don't know if you know the Greek word for newspapers, which is ephemerides. And it's because like the paper is so thin that it's ephemeral, but also the news is ephemeral at the same time. So I think your poem sort of completely exemplify that idea that's been in my head of the materiality of the page and of the poem being gone at the same time. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the just sort of the design of this notebook in line with what the poems are doing and how you might see it as part of a larger project, and how it came to be in this form. And
yeah, I mean, it is a very ephemeral little book. It even has this little thing that can slip out and be lost, and with one of the poems, and with all the notebook pages and so forth. Like you said earlier, the idea that maybe you could write your own poem in those pages and take notes and stuff. So and this kind of rounded corner suggests the notebook as well, and different kinds of ledger paper and things like that. But which is all kinds of notebooks that I've probably written in. But for me, the idea of the notebook and why this project kind of is always, on one hand, it's really kind of about the tropes of winter, literary tropes from Ovid to many others. But it's also about the notebook and this sort of, like you said, and a space of now and ephemerality. But of course, what I'm taking from the notebooks is highly rearranged and re-edited, and it's not so of the moment in the end, but it is attempting to capture actually what those momentary movements and synapses of thought are to some degree, and also some of the looseness and throwaway aspect of the notebook. The notebook is also a space where you can perform, right? That you can perform a self without kind of self-consciously, because you kind of, it's only for you in a way, but you're conscious that it could be read, could be accidentally flipped open inopportunely. And in a way, it's a kind of conscious, always like journal writing, a conscious even sometimes unconscious, but it is a performance of self, of selfhood. So I think that twins for me in some way in this series of poems, a kind of thinking about what a lyric poem can be now under various pressures, but technological, political, social, and just kind of coming in the end times of history, perhaps, or also in a highly ahistorical moment in a lot of ways, or where ahistoricity is problematic. So for me, these poems are like ways of dealing with the history of literary tradition, which so much of it now seems totally unnecessary and obsolete, that it is kind of just like some notebook you found somewhere that just happens to have something like Sappho and fragments and so forth. And so I'm interested in the ways that these kind of obsolete traditions could be salvaged or not that I'm interested in holding on to them for their own value or some conservative notion of like Eliot's tradition, but that I'm kind of curious about what they mean now, and what do I do having inherited them, or potentially having the opportunity to inherit them. Where does that leave me? Am I also obsolete? Is this like even the notebook compared to the computer screen is such a sort of old-fashioned space, right? I don't know, maybe you can lead me to more clear thoughts on that.
No, it's really interesting how the notebook sort of keeps living on. I think for a lot of us, I use a notebook. I have several different ideas.
maybe one thing I would add, like, because you said the materiality, and that is also something that is sort of old-fashioned about this. And this project, of course, is unlike any other book I'll probably ever get to make, because of Emily Larned's work at Alder and Frankia, and her own, like, she basically did all of this with equipment she owns and by hand and with paper she had in stock, that, you know, it would be very hard to do this again, right? And so that there's a certain kind of ephemerality that she's interested in the printing process and the materials that you can't reconstruct. They're not like pixels on a screen that kind of come back into arrangement as soon as you click the link, you know. So that ephemerality too, I think in this kind of, I was very lucky to work with Emily on this, because I don't think I could find a better suited object to reflect some of the values of the poems or interests of the poems. And on the other hand, I'm very happy to publish the work going forward in very different kinds of editions that might not be so handmade and reach a different kind of audience and different kind of readership. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering about, if there are next installments of this, or if there are future notebooks that will be in a similar form, or if they will change. And
yeah, I think they won't be like, the next book is in a more, I would say, more small press chapbook form. It even has an ISBN. It's more like probably 400 copies rather than 170. So it'll reach a different, it might be distributed by SPD. So it's like a very different, and I'm interested in that because for Emily, there's a different audience, an audience of people who know me, but also an audience of people who follow her work. And so that's like, it puts the work in a different place. And this next one will put the work in the realm of this other small press phonograph in Portland, Oregon, which has its own networks and connections. And so I'm interested in the work traveling in different ways and different forms, and also like giving the publisher freedom to make of it what they think can be made of this work, so that it can be a collaboration.
Yeah, and in terms of traveling, as we're moving towards your reading of translation, I thought maybe I could ask you a little bit about sort of your relationship with translation, or we could also talk about it after you read if you prefer.
Yeah. Sure. I think you had also had a question about the line about American.
Yeah.
Women.
So actually, because you were mentioning travel related to this notebook, it's interesting that I think the lines travel a lot across languages as well. And there were these two lines, as you mentioned, that I really got positively stuck on. We're all American and there's our own language to worry about. And then it is winter, grammar with no relation to me, diagram disconnected. So I was just thinking about this idea of worrying about our language as a child, like a child that we care for and that we were constantly nurturing and caring about, which is what the line, we're all American and there's our own language to worry about. And perhaps that was only in my head, but I was just wondering if we have our own language to worry about, what does that mean for someone who lives in a few languages, who translates?
Yeah. Well, I think that, sorry, there's a car alarm. It's Brooklyn. What can you do? But for me, that line rings extremely sarcastically, and but that's because of its context, and I think it has to do with a kind of solipsistic or kind of monolingual space of American poetics that comes out of perhaps Williams. Even though I love Williams, I have nothing against, but there is a certain kind of, and out of some space of thinking about like what is American specifically, maybe Whitman also, and that sort of desire for American poetry to push away from its European English heritage and kind of start its own manifest destiny kind of poetry that has its own language. And so American poets are frequently looking for that American speech, but for me that speech is adopted, And so for me, when I say ain't or something like that, it's super self-conscious. I mean, not to mention some of the other locutions here in these poems that are kind of chosen to stick out because of who is saying them, you know. And I think that is something I'm interested in confronting in even in avant-garde American poetry traditions, is their particular kind of attitude toward the foreign, and their kind of xenophobia of a kind, or kind of respectful xenophobia, let's say, at times. But also I was thinking, when you asked that question about one of the lines in the first poem I read, which is dom, 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 the sound of the bell being home. And of course, dom in Slavic languages and in Russian, particularly for me, means home. So the dom and home, and seeing that rhyme and kind of thinking about the bell sound, and sounds moving, like, of course, Matthias noted the meuble, which is there for this kind of almost linguistic disorientation. Or in one of the poems I read, there was that great Portuguese word, saudade, right? Words that are sort of thought of as untranslatable. So in a way, I'm interested in playing with the feel of these poems as if maybe they are translated from another language, and trying to find an equivalent in American English, but having a little bit of trouble with it. So that's why I read also that poem that has a Russian word, pретенциозен. And interestingly, when that was translated recently into Russian, they used the German word.
I thought it was German too, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that happens with languages, right? I mean, as people meet, words meet. Schlanga, you know, for you know, they have so many words in every language which comes from another one, and we just tend to forget that. And it's just so nice to kind of like see them traveling in poetry. And we travel to another poet now, to your current project, translating Osip Mandelstam, and he has a connection already with the section you read about Ovid. His second big book, Tristia, is also a dialogue with Ovid. So exile is a theme in Mandelstam's poems, and also winter becomes a very strong and harsh theme as a trope in his poems when he is exiled to Siberia. I remember this one poem, Alone I Stare into the Frost's White Face. And maybe you will just read some poems and introduce us a little bit to Mandelstam, who is really, I think, one of the most important writers of the 20th century in the Russian tongue.
Thank you. So I will just share my screen briefly. This is Mandelstam pictured after his first arrest for partly arrested in 1934 for disseminating orally a poem about Stalin that was rather indecorous and actually not, in some ways, not a great poem, but a great propaganda poem that was meant as an anti-Stalin poem, a kind of caricature. And this is Mandelstam later in 1938 at his last arrest, so just 4 years later, after exile, not in Siberia, but in Voronezh in the south of Russia, which you think might be warmer, but actually the winters are also very harsh, and in sort of the breadbasket in the what's called the Black Earth region of Russia. I'll read, for this first poem, I'm going to share the screen so you can see the poem. I am not going to do that for all of them. And I'm going to read poems from that exile. So yeah, Ovid has a lot to do with, he's reading, definitely looking back to Ovid in this period of a few years, and the Veronas Notebooks, which also have are in part of an inspiration for my little winter notebooks. Of course, there's a lot of Mandelstam in there too, because I've been translating Mandelstam during this time while writing these poems. So the Veronas Notebooks, which is what this exiled body of work is called during his exile from like 34, 35 to like 37, is one of his most productive, actually his most productive period as a poet, strangely enough, in which he is attempting to, on one hand, dealing with a kind of alienation from the Soviet writer establishment and a feeling that he may not ever get back to it, or that he may be condemned to even be completely sacrificed and die in this isolated kind of unpublished exile. On the other hand, he's desiring to become accepted as a Soviet poet. And so this is the body of work I've been dealing with my co-translator, John High, for about 14 years or something. And we've recently ramped up our work and are getting close to finishing. And so I'll read a few poems. Not as the white moth dusted with flour to the earth will I return this borrowed ash. I want this thinking body to change into a street, a country, this spinal charred body conscious of its length. The call of the dark green pine needles wreathes the color of a well's depth, pull life and precious time along, leaning on mounts of death. Red flag pine needles in a ring, wreaths like bold alphabets. Comrades of the latest draft, going about their work in the coarse skies, silently the infantry carries by, exclamations of rifles on their shoulders, and thousands of anti-aircraft guns, eyes either brown or blue, walking in disorder, people upon people who will continue in their stead. So you see in this poem some of the imagery of maybe a Soviet military parade. It's also about the death of some pilots who died during like practice flights. It was some, for whatever reason, a big story in the newspaper. So he's attempting to reflect that, but also thinking about his own death, that he's not going to die in a plane crash and return his dust like this exploded white moth dust to the ground. If there were any differences in the translation that you noticed, it's because I'm reading some slightly new versions. And in the next poem, actually, I'm going to show you some working draft stuff. Can you see that okay, or should I make it bigger? Okay, so I'm going to read this later draft, but as you can see, we're still trying to figure out a few little details. This is from a little bit later in the series, in the notebooks. Ruptures of round coves, cartilage, azure, the slow sail made longer by a cloud, cut off from you, though I had barely known you. Sour seagrass, tangled as organ fugues, false hair, it smells of some long-lived lie. My head drunk with this iron tenderness, as rust gnaws slowly at the sloping shore. So why these other sands under my head? Guttural Urals, broad-shouldered Volga banks, or this plain province. Here are all my rights. I owe it still, full chest, to breathe them in. And I think you can hear the idea of exile here, and especially like Ovid, Mandelstam is wondering why he has to be in this place of all places. Whereas he's remembering some ocean, some kind of almost Mediterranean, or actually Black Sea possibly, landscape where the rust gnaws slowly at the sloping shore. And there's the round coves, the cartilage, the azure, this idea of like this, the sail. So this seaside scene is actually the Black Sea, but he doesn't get to be there even. He gets to be somewhere either in the Urals or in this plain province, which is the province of plains of Veronas, where there's just farms and fields. But you can see some of the attempts to work on this, and so we're probably still going to go back. I still like false braided, but it's kind of hard to do this right. But anyway, so that's it for my sharing for a moment. I'll read a couple more. Does that sound good on time, or how are we? Yeah, okay. Another poem, this is from earlier on in 35, that also has to do with the kind of this distance from the center of things. True, I'm lying in the earth, my lips moving. School kids will learn by heart what I'm about to say. On Red Square, the earth is at its roundest. Its slope is unintentionally expansive. Roundest of all, the earth on Red Square. Its slope stiffens, giving way, reclining down to rice paddies, while on earth, the last slave is alive. Armed with the vision of narrow wasps that suck the axis of the earth's axis, I sense everything I have come to witness in vain. I remember it by heart. Don't draw and don't sing. Don't drag a black-voiced bow over the strings. I only sting and drink in life and love to envy the mighty, cunning wasps. If only one of these days I too could be, by churring air and summer's warmth, forced, bypassing death and dream, to really hear the axis of the earth's axis. What do you think? How many more of these should I read?
I think one.
One, okay. Let me think which one. Okay, I'll read a not long one. This one is a kind of unusual. Well, it may be too polemical. Okay. This January, nowhere to go. Wide open city, recklessly tenacious. I'm drunk. What, from locked doors? Driven to moans from all these locks and catches. Barking alleys with their hanging socks, low cellars, mangled streets, hooligans hide hastily in nooks, dart out from every crook and cranny. Toward the ice-encrusted water pump, slipping into a ditch, its warty crown, and stumbling, I eat dead air, and the rooks fly off in a fever. Gasping after them, I screech into some frigid wooden box. Bring me a reader, counsel, doctor, if only we could talk on this barbed stair. So that's Mandelstam.
It's beautiful, and I wonder, especially as you're showing us the small, like the different choices you're grappling with right now. I'm wondering, what are some of the biggest worries or things that are difficult to translate about his poetry, about his Russian into English?
Well, there are some neologistic moments. I didn't read this poem, Black Earth, which is one of the first poems in the notebooks, the Veronas Notebooks, that has these really strange neologisms that have typically been smoothed out by other translators, and we're trying to find ways of combining English words to combine them in similar ways as the Russian. A lot of it is tonal, or obviously we are not trying to solely look for the end rhymes or something like that. probably noticed, there are maybe some things that look like end rhymes or sound a little like rhymes, but for the most part, we're being careful not to make that a major point. We're trying to keep with some metrical feeling for the poems, but not over the top. Mandelstam's poems are rhymed and metered, but the meter is actually kind of loose. Often there will be changes in metrical pattern throughout a poem, and he also the thing about these poems is that they're very dense and very at times really hard. They're somewhat obtuse at times and really hard to get at what is going on. There's a long poem we worked on for a couple of months called Verses on the Unknown Soldier, which is a kind of anti-war poem, and it's cosmic and frightening, and it has so many different scientific language and different modes of discourse that are very oblique at times, and a lot of it really is about making something usable in English to still have the metaphorical quality of his work, to not pin it down too much, but also not for the English reader to have something to grab onto, because a lot of the time what happens with Mandelstam, and especially there are political reasons for this, because a lot of the poems he was really trying to write as a Soviet poet. And he's actually coming from a tradition that sees the writer as socially responsible to his nation, and a kind of coming from an embrace of the revolution as a historical necessity. But in English, Mandelstam has been translated as a kind of free spirit who got punished by Stalin, and that simplifies things quite a lot. So we read him through his death, and he did die at the hands of the state that Stalin barely knew anything about it. But Mandelstam really wanted to have a dialogue with the ruling class. He had opinions about what was right and what was wrong about the Soviet Union, and he wanted to be accepted as a Soviet poet, because he felt that he had this. He was very, he came out of being a very famous young poet before the revolution, and he thought he had a role to play in the new society, which had emancipated him. He was Jewish during the Tsarist times. He felt like he couldn't be a Russian poet if, in those times, full-fledged, and the revolution gave him this sort of emancipation from a lot of those class and nationalist politics. So he really believed that this was a world where he could voice what the people wanted, would voice the people in a way and witness for the people. And he was thwarted in that attempt, because what he did was maintain an ambivalence throughout these poems about the ability of the poet to become part of the collective, the national collective spirit, and the necessity of the poet to be singular, to be like a Dante, who he always compares himself to, to go against the society and to point out its ills and so forth, right? Like Dante does in the Inferno. And so he's a highly political poet from the beginning, but he's trying to balance these things, like what it means to come from the time before the revolution and still be relevant to a new period, how to bring traditions from the old times to these new times. Are they meaningful to the working class, and these kinds of questions. So that is what's, it's really hard to maintain that in English and make sure that that there is that duality constantly in the poems.
That's quite a challenge, especially since English already kind of has its own sort of inbuilt assumptions about Russian, and especially about that period. Like you said, it's quite the challenge.
But of course, a lot of it is like trying to get the right sound, and sometimes I'm not so sure that it has to be word for word. I've kind of moved away from that kind of thinking. I think sometimes you need a couple words for one word if it's polyvalent, and to show that it isn't just one thing, you know. And so that's where we're trying to negotiate like line length to what the meaning is, to the sound, how to get the interplay of sounds going, you know, because he's very sound oriented as a poet too.
Is it helpful to work with another poet and to have those conversations?
Yes, and I never would have started this project if John High, who is an American poet of a little bit older than me, from a different, somewhat different aesthetics, but close, and we are the fact that he's been thinking about Mandelstam for much longer than I have, and also he kind of asked me just to try to help him out with some of his drafts. And then we realized that we needed to go back to the grammar, we needed to go back to the syntax, we needed to like anchor this, and then it slowly grew into this huge project. And it's wonderful. I would never do this alone. I would, first of all, I would never be able to make the final choice without that kind of dialogue. Also, like, it's hard enough with two people, but with one person, I would just be constantly going back and forth. Oh, maybe that version's better, maybe that. And it also is so helpful to read out loud all the time. Like, we read the Russian out loud, we read the English out loud over and over. And alone you might just kind of quit after a while, but you have each other to push it further and keep saying, well, it's not quite right, and John will say, oh, I knew you were going to say that, uh-oh, we have to start, think about it again. So it's exciting, it's more fun. And also I think I would say that it's more than it's not about compromise, it's really about collaboration. And we bring, he's writing a lot about the history of Mandelstam's arrests, whereas I'm writing about the history of Mandelstam's translations in English, or the translations of Mandelstam in English. And so we're complementing each other also in the research and so forth. It's just this one poet is probably too much for one translator to handle.
Yeah, and also I wonder if this is part of it too, but I wonder if the task of bringing a voice that hasn't been represented correctly or hasn't been heard very much can be quite lonely if it's just one translator with the poet, and it's a voice that doesn't really answer back and there's not much to do about it. So I don't know if that's also part of
yeah. Sure, for sure. Speaking of lesser known poets, do you think there's time to read Elena Guerrero?
Yes.
Should I read one piece of hers and one of Harms, or?
No, let's make it two of hers. And Daniel Harms is a poet or a writer and absurdist I'm very fond of, and who kind of like brought me on my endeavors, living in Moscow for 2 years, and it was partly to Harms because I was really charmed. And I think it has to do with his name, which I still obviously think it's between charm and Holmes. I think he was a Sherlock Holmes fan, right? Yeah. And so the story about Harms is so broad that we have to invite you again for just giving us a presentation on Daniel Harms. So let's wrap it up now with a poet you kind of really translate for the first time, I think, into English.
So just the Elena Guerrero. I think what I would just say about Elena Guerrero is she's part of the Russian futurist movement. In a way, she precedes it. She was born in 1877, so she's a little bit older. Mandelstam was born in 1891. So she's a little bit older than most of that young modernists, avant-garde crowd, futurists and acmeists and so forth. She's a painter and visual artist, and she gets involved in the early 20th century with founding a couple of organizations that were interested in the new avant-garde art. And then she starts writing kind of about that time, and she writes 3 books. One of them is published posthumously, and that's the one I'm translating. Some of which, most of which was translated, but is out of print in an edition in the 80s for a very small edition. And there's other work of hers that I am translating for the first time. But the work I'll read now is from this book, which was published in 1914, a year after her death. She died of leukemia rather young. But will just preface that by saying, like, she was this incredibly important figure for 4 poets we do know, like Chlebnikov, Krchonych, Mayakovsky. These people knew her and came to her salon and learned from her, even though she is very different from them. But she had some kind of very special place in their pantheon. And that is something I'm very curious about, because there are different themes that each of those people, those better known poets, take up. And so by the 20s, Elena Guerrero was not published anymore in the Soviet Union, just sort of fell out of the canon. And only more recently, there have been interest, particularly feminist writers are really interested in her in Russia. And there's been some scholarly work done on her in the last 20 years, but very little. So she's still kind of a bit of an unknown, and I've published some of her poems in periodicals, and hopefully we'll have a book out sometime in a year or two. So this is from the first piece in Elena Guerrero's book, Little Camels of the Sky. A newspaper advertisement: especially warm camel down jerseys, underpants, tights, and belly warmers. It is done as follows. They ambush and capture good spirits, kind ones on the tall side that look like lanky golden baby camels, covered in the down of divine light. Then they drive a bunch of these together, whips snapping about the air, and the tender, good-hearted creatures, too kind, really, to understand how it is that pain is made, crowd together tightly, each extending a neck over another, pressing themselves against the crude fence, shredding their tender down in the crush. And it's this down of the baby camels of the sky that warms with its springtime life-bearing warmth that they pick up off the ground and from it weave jerseys. And what about the poor baby camels? Will they kill them just like that? They asked me in some distress. Why, there's no need to kill them. They'll drive them on for a while until all the down comes off, and then let them go back into the sky until the next time. And their down will grow back in no more than a minute, even better than before. Okay, and then I'll read one of the last pieces in the book. It's kind of a very different style. The book ranges from poems, fragments, diaristic kind of elements. And that's what I think I love about Guerrero, is this sort of pastiche of forms, from like little vignettes like that one, to conversations, to fragments, very short poems, short stories also. And it reminds me a bit of the way Jean Toomer structured Cain, that wonderful book in the 20s, and other modernists were working in this way. And I think she did it very early on. So this is another piece that's more of a proclamation. It's called Promise It. Swear to it, distant ones and near ones, you who write with ink on paper, with your gaze on clouds, paint on canvas, swear never to betray or slander that beautiful ephemeral creation, the face of your reverie, be it friendship or faith in people or in your own songs. Reverie, you've let it live, now it lives. Already this creation does not belong to us, just as already we do not belong to ourselves. Swear it, especially you who write your gaze on the clouds change shape. It is so easy to defile with faithlessness their day-old visage. Promise it, please. Promise it to life. Promise it to me. Promise.
This is the perfect end when we can promise reverie live. Thank you so much, Anca. Thank you so much, Matvei, for these wonderful readings and the conversation. Thank you all for coming. This was our last event this semester. We wish you a wonderful evening. Please join us now for the after party. Walter is sending you the link once more right now. You'll find it on your screen in the chat. Please copy and paste and join us for a drink. The International Writer Series will return next spring. Please stay tuned for more exciting events, and thank you very much.